So we've been talking about managing emotions in organizations, and I've been alluding to what emotions are, what moods are, and the positive benefits an organization gets by maintaining a more positive mood and more positive emotions amongst their workers. One of the ways that they can specifically do this is referred to, generally speaking, as organizational compassion. It's the steps taken by an organization's officials to alleviate the suffering of its employees or others. So it's basically what is the plans put in place to try to manage the emotions and to recognize that emotions will impact people's behavior. So an example of this might be the death of several employees in a carpooling wreck, but it can be many other things. But basically it is there known resources, and has the organization made it clear how it will help someone if they are struggling emotionally? And we're going to quickly go over some of the advantages and disadvantages of providing this kind of a plan. So an organization's compassion is basically involving the scope, scale, speed, and specification of its support. So low compassion on scope would be a limited range of resources are used to help. In other words, maybe only time off. Well, if you need some time off, you can take it. That would be low compassion or low scope. High compassion would be a wide range of resources are used to help. Money, time off, physical aid, maybe access to counselors or people to be able to talk to. All of those would be an example of scope. So I've been in both situations. I've been in an organization which honestly wouldn't even give time off if you were emotionally struggling. The current organization I'm in, not only is it perfectly acceptable to take basically sick days as emotional support days, there's also a wide range of available support for emotional needs, including free counseling services. The next would be scale. Limited support given would be an example of low compassion. High compassion would be extensive support given. So again, how much? So not only what is it, but how much access do you have? So for example, if there is a single virtual 15-minute counseling session you can get and that's it, that might be high compassion and scope, but low on scale. Conversely, if you have access to up to 15 hours of free counseling, that might be both high scope and high scale. The next would be speed, lengthy delay before helping. For instance, you have to actually put in a request. It won't go into the initial schedule. You might get some time off in 2 weeks versus limited to no hesitation before helping. And again, the speed is another factor of how quickly can you get access to these various things. So for example, if an organization only provided time off, low scope, the only time off was allowed was up to 24, or let's say up to 2 days, 16 hours, lower scale, but you could immediately take that at any point. That would be high speed. However, likewise, if there was only 2 days available, it's the only thing that they offered, and you had to put in for it, and it might take 2 weeks to get approval, that would also be low speed. And finally, specialization. So actions taken are generic, one-size-fits-all situations. In other words, no matter what happened, you've got one resource. And again, you can kind of think about a low compassion organization. The only option is time off. You don't get a lot of it. It takes a while to get it, and it's the only thing that you can put in for. Versus specialization, actions taken fit the specific nature of the situation encountered. This might also include an organization adding additional support for specific occurrences that are happening both in the community, amongst its workers, and within its own organization. So again, you can kind of think about, what has any organization that you've worked for, how would it stack up on this idea of scope, scale, speed, and specialization? And if you're building an organizational compassion system, if you're trying to think about how do we make a safety net to where people that are having emotional difficulties are expressing basically or experiencing extreme emotions, whether positive or negative, how can we help them through that process? And what systems can we put in place? Now, I'm going to hit a common drum beat in all of these modules, and that is, of course, communication. Having a highly compassionate, high scope, high scale, high speed, high specialization system of organizational compassion doesn't do much if no one knows about it. It also has to be clearly communicated, and it also has to be very clear that there's no repercussions for using these. And I've seen that in some organizations as well, that by purely putting it onto paper, their organizational compassion seems to be fairly high. Until you realize that anyone that takes advantage of these is generally seen in a negative light. It's often held against them when their next performance appraisal comes up. And a lot of people don't even know this system exists. It needs to be highly acceptable to take the offerings, and it also needs to be highly recognized by people within the organization for it to have that effect on emotion and mood. So moving beyond just what an organization can do as far as organizational compassion, emotions, and moods, we also want to talk about emotional stressors. So emotional dissonance is the inconsistency between the emotions we feel and the emotions we express, what we think and feel compared to how we act. And a lot of jobs do require some form of emotional dissonance. For example, if you are service with a smile, if you're doing basically customer service, if you're doing sales, if you're working at an hourly job, which requires you to interact with the public, you're probably expected to do so as if you're enjoying the job and you're enjoying taking that order, regardless of how you feel. Now, we've all probably been to a fast food restaurant where people were not bothering with emotional dissonance, and we could tell that they would rather be just about anywhere else. But when you encounter someone in that kind of a field that is behaving as if they're enjoying their job, they're enjoying their work, and they're enjoying with you, they're probably doing some form of emotional dissonance. They're projecting what's expected, not necessarily what they feel. Emotional labor is the psychological effort involved in holding back one's true emotions. This effort in dealing with emotional dissonance. And that's really what causes emotional stress, is a difference between how we feel and how we need to behave, and also then the effort to be able to deal with this situation. And I can tell you that I've had really good days at work where I've been in a good mood, and it's been very easy for me to fulfill my role and be very pleasant to others. There are other days where when I'm at work, I'm not necessarily in a great social mood, but I'm still expected to behave as such, which means I have to put some effort into it. And that's what we're talking about with emotional labor. So what this causes when there is this emotional dissonance and emotional labor, we can start talking about stress. And it's important to remember that stress is not necessarily that people are being disturbed by specific things, it's their perception of those things. Because also when we're talking about stress, we're not actually talking about physical danger. That's a completely different process. What we're talking about is perceiving a situation as stressful, and that's a lot about perception. And it very well may not necessarily be a stressful situation, but that doesn't matter if we're perceiving it as a stressful situation. So what is stress? Stress is made of components. The first one is a stressor, any demand, either physical or psychological in nature, encountered during the course of living. And stressors are not bad things. Stressors are what provide challenges. Stressors are what makes life enjoyable. Running into things that we need to overcome as we encounter them in the course of living is part of what goal setting is about, for that matter. However, we do also want to be aware of the effect of too many stressors or stressors that we're not equipped to deal with. So our cognitive appraisal is a judgment about the stressfulness of the situation based on the extent to which someone perceives a stressor as threatening and capable of coping with its demands. So for example, if there is a stressor, we see it as not particularly threatening, and we feel our self-efficacy is that we can easily cope with it, it's probably not going to be much more of a problem. However, if our appraisal of the stressor is that it is threatening, it is well beyond our ability to cope with, that's much more likely to result in additional stress. So stressors can result in stress based on our cognitive appraisal. And that cognitive appraisal is both determining how stressful we feel that situation is or threatening, and also compared to our capacity to cope with it at that particular moment. So stress is a pattern of emotional states and psychological and physiological reactions occurring in response to the demands from within or outside an organization. So basically, stress is our response to too many stressors. Strain is a deviation from our normal states of human functioning resulted from prolonged exposure to stressful events. So basically, stress is normal. I'm experiencing stress right now as I record this. I know I need to record these lectures. I'm also aware of other things that I need to get done today, and that is providing a bit of stress, knowing I need to finish this lecture, trying to do a good job, trying to make sure that I don't misspeak a word or say something that I have to kind of correct. But at the same time, it's not really causing strain. It's not causing prolonged exposure. I'm going to get it done. I have high self-efficacy. I know that this is something that I can do, so it's not going to result in strain. However, if I was having to do a bunch of lectures, I didn't have enough time to do them. I knew I didn't have enough time to do them, and I also was not very comfortable doing online lectures. That prolonged exposure to those stressful events might result in strain. And strain also results in not only lower performance, it also starts to result in not just psychological states, it also has physiological responses. Backaches, nausea, breaking out, all of these can be the result of strain. So let's talk about the process of stress at a very simple level, kind of just putting together everything we've already talked about. So at the start, we have a stressor. So for instance, we might have a particular assignment is due. We know that it is something that we're going to have to put some time and effort into, and that's a stressor. Now notice it isn't strain yet. It isn't necessarily, it's simply something that could cause stress. So again, we need that second step, which is that cognitive appraisal. Now, depending on that cognitive appraisal, the cognitive appraisal may be, I'm very capable of doing this, and I really don't have much else to do today. This stressor is easily overcome, and that would stop the process. However, if the cognitive appraisal is, this is going to be a very difficult project, and it's yet one more project I need to do on a stack of a large number of projects that are all due right now, I'm not sure I'm capable of handling this. That cognitive appraisal then is going to result in stress. In this case, the stress, if it continues, in other words, if day after day we're constantly being given more and more to do, we're constantly failing to get those other projects done, that's going to be that prolonged stress, and that results in strain, an actual psychological burnout, if you will, and possibly even a physiological burnout, as we're constantly being exposed to an over level of stress. Now, this is going to be a very individual process because of that cognitive appraisal component. Some people might be at the exact level of the same expectations, just as many papers, just as much expectation, but are really good at writing papers and perceive it as a manageable task. They're not going to experience stress. But another person might have, again, the exact same amount of requirements, but they perceive it as a more difficult task, and they're not sure how they're going to complete all the tasks possible. That's going to result in stress. The more stress we experience, and for the longer we experience stress, the more likely stress becomes strain. So another way to think of stress is that it tends to be a cyclic process. So we've already talked about the cyclic nature of many ideas. Again, the idea of open systems model, that all organizations bring in outside resources, including people. They then do throughputs. So within the organization, those people, those resources are changed into something else. They have outputs, the actual production of what the company makes. And then that production goes back out to the environment where feedback informs the company of whether they should continue what they're doing in the way they've done it. So the same kind of happens with stress. What would happen if a stressor causes your performance to decline? So I'm stressed. It's causing strain. Because of strain, I have poorer job performance. Because I have poorer job performance, stressors are becoming even harder. In other words, individual tasks that used to be easy are now becoming harder and harder, which results in more stress, which results in more strain, which results in more poorer job performance. And you can see how this cycle can become a very self-predictive and negative cycle. So it's important for organizations, especially managers, to be kind of managing what is the stressors and experiences they're putting in front of their employees, and to watch for this cycle, because this is not a cycle that's going to result in someone performing well. It's a cycle that's going to result in someone's performance becoming worse and worse over time. So let's talk a little bit about the causes of stress and strain. And we're first going to talk about occupational demands. So we're going to talk about making decisions, constantly monitoring devices or materials, repeatedly exchanging information with others, working in unpleasant physical conditions, or performing unstructured versus structured tasks. All of these will impact how much people, again, that cognitive appraisal process. So remember that through this entire process, when a stressor is found, we're going to make a cognitive appraisal. We're going to determine how much do we have to do? Do we have the ability to handle it? And if the answer to that is we have enough, we don't have too much to do, and we do have the ability, that stressor is not going to result in stress. However, if we make the determination, I've got too much to do and I'm not sure I can do it, that's more likely to turn into stress. All of these are occupational demands that make it more likely that someone will experience stressors becoming actual stress. We're going to talk about each one in turn. So the first one is making decisions. So why is this stressful? The main reason for this is that every decision actually is accountable for. So as someone, if you're in an organization and you never have to make a decision, that alone means that job is probably going to be less stressful overall than a job that requires a lot of decision making. So again, if someone is in a position or a role where they have to make a lot of decisions, the buck stops here. They're making financial decisions, they're making personnel decisions, they're making final determinations on whether a project will go forward or whether a plan will be implemented. This is stressful because with each decision, there also is the knowledge that whether or not that decision was right will come back to haunt them, either positively or negatively. So again, we want to think about when we have jobs that are going to have a high occupational demand of making decisions, we want to be a little bit more aware of this process of stressors becoming stress, becoming strain. Constantly monitoring devices or materials. Have you ever had a job where you couldn't get work done because you had to answer the phone all the time, constantly deal with customers? This is the same thing. And again, if the job role involves this, I know I actually, by the middle of any day, I get to really dread the noise of bing, because bing means another email just came in. And in my particular role currently as a consultant, pretty much every email generally requires me to respond fairly quickly to it. So if I'm trying to do some analysis, it's going to take 2 or 3 hours, and every 10 minutes, bing, there's a new email asking me to address something, answer some question. It increases my stress. So again, when we're thinking of occupational demands, if we've got a role that constantly requires monitoring devices and materials, especially if that person is expected to be doing anything else than that task, we're probably going to see, again, a higher likelihood that stressors are perceived as stress. Repeatedly exchanging information with others. Would you like to form an alliance? So basically, if your job requires an enormous amount of maintaining social relationships and making sure everyone is informed with current information, is again stressful. So again, what about if we're having to share bad news? What if we're having to share other kinds of news? But basically, the reason this becomes stressful is, again, it's that accountability. If information doesn't get shared, we're the one that's going to be held accountable for that information falling through. And again, I often find that I make notes to myself on my weekly calendar. So for instance, earlier today, I actually put a note on Friday, make sure you follow up on a particular task. And what that task is sharing information, because I'm actually not ready to share it yet. I need to gather it a little bit more, but I also want to make sure it doesn't fall through the cracks. That requires a little more effort and a little bit more knowledge to make sure that I'm attending to it. So again, if an occupation requires a fair amount of maintaining social relationships and sharing critical information, we also run into a situation where we'd expect to find more situations where stressors are becoming stress. Obviously, working in unpleasant physical conditions, and there's a fair amount of jobs here. So there's a lot of TV shows that basically like World's Most Dangerous Catch that kind of follows more dangerous jobs. So if you're actually in worry of your physical safety, potentially even your life, even if it's an unlikely event occurring, that's going to be an additional stressor, knowing that if I mess up, it could not just be a paper being wrong or someone getting mad at me. It might actually be vast physical damage to myself, including potential loss of life. So there's a fair amount of workplaces out there that are unpleasant conditions. For a short while, one of my relatives actually was working on an oil rig right outside of Saudi Arabia. And the lowest the temperature ever was a comfortable 95 degrees or higher, in addition to being on an oil rig platform in the middle of the Arabic Sea. I also had a friend once that actually took a job in South Pole, basically Antarctica. They were down there for 6 months and constantly having to worry about the heating and staying warm and also just keeping themselves occupied while being cut off from the rest of the world. These are examples of unpleasant physical conditions. And again, we find that in these situations, it is much more likely for people to have issues with stressors becoming stress and strain. The final occupational demand is performing unstructured rather than structured events. Or work. So again, this is a little bit, and all of these, by the way, are impacted by personality and individual differences. Some people actually thrive in dangerous environments and prefer jobs that are that way. Some people prefer unstructured roles, but broadly speaking, the more unstructured a job is, the more likely you're going to find stressful events, stressors, becoming stress and strain. So again, and we think about it, the more unstructured it is, the more you're probably accountable for coming up with innovative solutions, probably the larger the demand is for you to come up with how you're actually going to do this task compared to a very structured job, a manual listing of how to do it. This is how I do it, this is what's expected, and I know there's no question of what's going to happen, and I know as long as I do it, I'm doing it well. So you can kind of think a structured job is much more likely to be seen as manageable. That cognitive appraisal is much more likely to basically support, I can do this. An unstructured job, less likely. So again, hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of how we design jobs, or at least be aware of jobs' impact on the increase or decrease in the likelihood of stressors becoming stress and strain. We're going to continue talking about this in the next module. And as always, if you have any questions, please share them in the discussion board on Canvas.